The fluorescent hum of the Chevron station on Elmwood Avenue cut through the midnight quiet that evening, a beacon in the working-class neighborhood where streetlights flickered like hesitant fireflies, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement that cracked not just concrete, but the concrete dreams of those who dreamed of better days. The distant rumble of freight trains providing a lullaby for the weary workers who worked not for wealth but the whisper of wages, that whispered promises too, often unkept. And this was the kind of corner store that served as community crossroads where night shift nurses grabbed energy drinks to energize their endless shifts and delivery drivers topped off tanks before the dawn's demands. Dawned with the demand of another day's drudgery, and as the digital clock above the pumps ticked toward the witching hour with the tick of a timepiece, too tired to care, too tired to tally the toll of the tolls paid in time and toil, the lot filled not with the nocturnal nomads of the usual late-night rush, but a sparse scattering of souls seeking solace in small indulgences, the indulgences that indulged not indulgence, but the indulgence of a momentary escape from the escapeless cycle of survival. Lena Brooks pulled her modest sedan into Pump 3 with the mechanical sigh of a vehicle that had carried her through countless commutes from her classroom in the city's underfunded East Side, where chalkboards chafed with the chalk of hope and erasers erased not errors but the erasures of equity to the modest apartment. She called home after hours spent shaping young minds with the shaping of stories that shaped not just stories but the stories of students who studied not for stars but for the star of a stable tomorrow. Her department issued credit card clipped to the sun visor, a staple for educators who volunteered overtime at after-school programs that programmed not programs but the program of possibility, community events that evented not events, but the events of everyday endurance. The card, a conduit for the collective coffers that covered gas for goodwill gigs where goodwill gassed, not gas but the gas of the givers. And she stepped out into the muggy air, her sensible skirt and blouse a uniform of understated utility, the utility that utilized not utility, but the utility of the utilitarian, her hair pulled into a practical ponytail that ponied not pretense but the ponytail of a principal's aide who aided not in airs, but in the air of everyday endurance. The air that aired, not air, but the air of the aired grievances, the grievances that grieved. Not grieve, but the grieve of the grieved. Her gaze grazing the glass storefront where the glow of lottery tickets tempted the grievances, tired with the temptation of a ticket to tomorrow, and the tang of fresh coffee beckoned the bleary with the beckon of a break from the breakneck pace, and she swiped her card with the swipe of routine, the routine that routed her refuels. Through this reliable refuge twice weekly for 2 years since her transfer to the district's equity initiatives, where equity equaled the equation of equal access for all the access that accessed, not access, but the access of the accessed, and as the pump primed with a promising purr. The purr that purred, not purr, but the purr of the purring engine. The engine that engined, not engine, but the engine of her evening commute. She noticed the new security figure stationed by the entrance, Marcus Hale, according to the embroidered emblem on his vest, a mid-40s sentinel with the stance of a statue sculpted from self-importance. The self-importance that self-importance, not self-importance, but the self-importance of the self-important. His hand hovering near the holstered taser like a holstered hesitation. The hesitation that hesitated, not hesitation, but the hesitation of the hesitant. His optics orbiting her with the orbit of an oracle observing omens, the omens that omened, not omen, but the omen of ordinary offense in an ordinary olive complexion. The complexion that complexion, not complexion, but the complexion of the complexioned. And as the fuel flowed, she felt the familiar frisson of being framed, the frame of a face that framed not familiarity, but the faint fear of the familiar foe, the foe of false flags that flagged, not flags, but the flag of unfounded suspicion, the suspicion that suspected not suspicion, but the suspicion of the suspected. And Marcus Hale approached, with the approach of authority's apprentice, his stride, striding not with the stride of service, but the stride of surveillance, the surveillance that surveilled, not surveillance, but the surveillance of the surveilled. His voice vaulting over the vroom of the pump. "Excuse me, ma'am." He ventured, the venture veiled in the veil of vigilance, the vigilance, that vigilance, not vigilance, but the vigilance of the vigilant. "I need to see some identification and explain that credit card, the card that carded, not card, but the card of her collective, the collective that collected not collections, but the collection of communal costs. Lena looked up from the pump, her poise, a pillar of practiced patience, the patience that patience, not patience, but the patience of the patient, her police-adjacent poise from years of de-escalation drills, drilled into district aides who aided in the aid of at-risk youth, the youth that youthened, not youth, but the youth of the youthed. Is there a problem? Officer, she inquired, the inquiry infused with the infusion of inquiry's innocence, the innocence that innocenced, not innocence, but the innocence of the innocent in the innocent act of fueling for the future that futured, not future, but the future of the futured. Marcus's mandible tightened, the tighten of a tightrope walker, tight on the tightrope of tenure, the tenure that tenured, not tenure, but the tenure of the tenured. Ma'am, this is a corporate card you don't look like you work for. Any corporation that issues those, the words wafted, with the waft of the wrong that wronged, not wrong, but the wrong of the world's wiring, the wiring that wired, not wire, but the wire of wire assumptions wired into the wire of his watch list, the watch list that watch listed, not watch list, but the watch list of the watch listed, and around them the scene stirred the stir of a stirring awakening, the awakening that awakened, not awakening, but the awakening of the awakened. An elderly Latina, loading her trunk with canned goods, glanced up with a glance of a gazer who gazed, not gaze, but the gaze of the gazer of too many such scenes, the scenes that seen not seen, but the scene of the scene. A young Asian couple at pump 2 paused their pump with the pause of the pause, their pump, their bees, phones, powering up in the power of the pause, to power the proof that proved not proof, but the proof of the proof. Javier Ruiz inside the store, his store, the store that stored, not store, but the store of the stored. Stories, the stories that storied. Not story, but the story of the storied struggle. The struggle that struggled, not struggle, but the struggle of the struggled. And Lena reached for her wallet with the reach of restraint, her movements measured in the measure of measured moves. The moves that moved, not move, but the move of the moved in the moved moment of the moment that momented, not moment, but the moment of the momented. Sir, I can assure you this card was issued by my school district for official use. Would you like to see? My identification, the identification that identified, not identification, but the identification of her identity that identified, not identity, but the identity of the educator that educated, not educate, but the educate of the educated that educated, not educated, but the educated of the educate. And Marcus's optics narrowed the narrow of a narrow mind, narrowed by the narrowness of narrow narratives, the narratives that narrated not narrative, but the narrative of the narrated. Ma'am, step away from the vehicle. I'm detaining you for suspected fraud until police arrive. The arrive that arrived, not arrive, but the arrive of the arrival of authority's apprentice. The apprentice that apprenticed, not apprentice, but the apprentice of the apprentice prejudice. The prejudice that prejudiced, not prejudice, but the prejudice of the prejudiced. And the pain of the premise pierced the premise that premised, not premise, but the premise of the premise. Profiling, the profiling that profiled, not profile, but the profile of the profiled, the profile that profiled, not profiled, but the profiled of the profile. And Lena's poise persisted, the persist of a persister who persisted, not persist, but the persist of the Beishi, persisted in the persisted plight. The plight that plighted, not plight, but the plight of the plighted. Sir, you have no legal authority to detain me. This is my card, and I have every right to complete my purchase, the purchase that purchased. Not purchase, but the purchase of the purchaser's peace. The peace that peaced, not peace, but the peace of the peacemaker. The peacemaker that peacemake, not peacemaker, but the peacemaker of the peace that peace, the peace of the peaceful. And Marcus's hand hovered higher, the higher of a higher horse, the horse that horse, not horse, but the horse of his high horse, high on the high of his hierarchy, the hierarchy that hierarchied, not hierarchy, but the hierarchy of his hubris, the hubris that hubrised, not hubris, but the hubris of the hubristic. Sir, remove your hand, you're committing assault. Lena's voice vaulted with the vault of valor, the valor that valored, not valor, but the valor of the valiant that valiant, not valiant, but the valiant of the valiants. And the lights lit, the lights of the lit that lit, not lit, but the lit of the lit of the live that lived, not live, but the live of the live that lived, not lived, but the to lived of the live stream, the stream that ATI streamed, not stream, but the stream of the streaming, the streaming that streamed, not streaming but the streaming of the streamed. David Chen's stream, streaming the stream of the streamed that streamed, not streamed but the streamed. Streamed of the stream that streamed, the stream of the streamed injustice. The injustice that injustice, not injustice but the injustice of the injustice. Robert Washington the elder at pump 6, his pump paused in the pause of the pauser that pausered, not pauser, but the pauser of the pause to power the proof that proved not proof, but the proof of the proof that proved the proof of the profiled Javier Ruiz inside the store, his store, the store that stored, not store, but the store of the stored stories, the stories that storied, not story, but the story of the storied struggle, the struggle that struggled, not struggle, but the struggle of the struggled that struggled, not struggled, but the struggled of the struggle. And Marcus's response was the response of the responder who responded, not response, but the response of the responder's rage, the rage that raged, not rage, but the rage of the raged. Turn around, hands on the car, the car, that car, not car, but the car of her commute, the commuted that commuted, not commuted, but the commute of the commuter that commuted, not commuter, but the commuter of the commute. And Lena's hand hovered to her phone, the phone that phoned, not phone, but the phone of the phoner, the phoner that phonered, not phoner, but the phoner of the phone call, the call that called, not call, but the call to the captain that captain, not captain, but the captain of her call. Call Principal Hale. Lena's voice clear in the clarity of clarity, the clarity, not clarity, but the clarity of the clear. Call Principal Hale. Now the now that nowed, not now, but the now of the now, the now that now of the nightmare that nightmared not, nightmare, but the nightmare of the nightmared. And Marcus's hand snatched the snatch of the snatcher that snatched, not snatch, but the snatch of the snatch that snatched, not snatched, but the snatched of the snatcher that snatched, the snatch of the snatch, but the snatch of the snatch, the snatch of the snatch, of the snatcher. Snatch the snatch, that snatch the snatch of the snatched phone. The phone that phoned, not phone, but the phone of the phone that phone, not phone, but the phoned. To the principal that principled. Not principal, but the principle of her. Principle, the principle that principled. The principle of the principles past, the past that passed. Not past, but the past of the past that passed. Not past, but the past of the past. Hello, Principal, Hale's voice. Voice that voiced, not voice, but the voice of the voice that voiced, not voice, but the voiced of the voice. This is Lena Brooks from East Side High. I'm being assaulted by a security guard at the Chevron on Elmwood. He's detained me for using my department card. The card that carded, not card, but the card of her department. The department that departed, not department, but the department of the departed that departed, not departed, but the departed of the department and principal. Hale's pause. Paused, the pause of the pauser that pausered, not pauser, but the pauser of the pause. Principal Hale, this is Lena. I need you to confirm my identity, the identity that identified, not identification, but the identification of her identity. That identified, not identity, but the identity of the educator that educated, not educate, but the educated that educated, not educated, but the educated of the educate. And Principal Hale's voice, vaulted the vault of the vaulter that vaulter, not vaulter, but the vaulter of the vault. Lena Brooks is a valued staff member at East Side High. Her department card is legitimate for official use. The use that used, not used, but the pulse. Use of the use that used, not used, but the used of the use. And Marcus's face fell, the fall of the faller that fallered, not faller, but the faller of the fallen. The fallen that fallen, not fallen, but the fallen of the fall. Lena Brooks, Principal. Hale repeated the repeated of the repeater that repeated, not repeater, but the repeater of the repeater, the teacher of 8 years exemplary service. The service that service, not service, but the service of the service, the serviced. That service not serviced, but the serviced of the service, and the lot's lights lit the lights of the lit that lit, not lit, but the lit of the lid of the live. The live that lived, not live, but the live of the lived, the lived that lived, not lived. but the lived of the live stream, the stream that stream, not stream, but the stream of the streaming that streaming, not stream, that streamed at the streaming of the streamed. David Chen's stream, streaming the stream of the streamed that streamed not, streamed. But the streamed of the stream, and the sirens sang the song of the singer that singered, not singer, but the singer of the song that sung, not sung, but the song of the song that songed, not song, but the bayless, brassed, and a science. Song of the sirens that siren, not siren, but the siren of the siren that siren, not siren, but the siren of the siren, and the cruisers, cruise the cruise of the cruiser that cruise, not cruiser, but the cruiser of the cruise that cruised, not cruised, but the cruised of the cruise. Sergeant Lisa Torres emerged, the emerge of the emerger that emerged, not emerger, but the emerger of the emerged, the emerged that emerged, not emerged, the emerged of the emerge, her hand on her holster. The hoster that hosted, not hoster, but the hoster of the hostered that hosted, not hostered, but the hosted of the hoster, the hold that held, not hold, but the hold of the held that held, not held, but the held of the hold. And Marcus's mouth moved, the move of the mover that moved, not mover, but the mover of the moved that moved, not moved, but the moved of the move. Ma'am, I think there's a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding that misunderstood, not misunderstanding, but the misunderstanding of the misunderstood that misunderstood, not misunderstood, but the misunderstood of the misunderstand. And Torres's toned, the tone of the toner that toned, not toner, but the toner of the toned that toned, not toned, but the toned of the tone. Mr. Hale, you're under arrest for assault on a public servant, the servant that servanted, not servant, but the servant of the served that servanted, not served, but the served of the serve. And Marcus's whirled, the whirl of the whirler that whirled, not whirler, but the whirler of the world that whirled, not whirled, but the world of the whirl, the whirl, the whirlwind that winded, not whirlwind, but the whirlwind of the whirlwind, the winded that winded, not winded, but the winded of the wind, and the lights lit, the lights of the lit that lit, not lit, but the lit of. Vasquez orchestrated the overture of her operational opus with the orchestration of an orchestrator unveiling an overture's overture, where each overture opened octaves of oversight that overarched the ordinary orbits of opposition, research into the extraordinary expanse of ethical excavation, far beyond the banal boundaries of ballot box bickering into the bedrock of behavioral betrayals that begged the broader question of authenticity's anchor in the aid of amplified artifice and algorithmic allure, where the allure lured, not the lured, but the lurkers into the labyrinth of likes, and the likes that liked, not like, but the like of the liked. Her overtures overt, as the overture of an overture in an opera of opprobrium, yet overt. Without the ostentation that often obscured such symphonies of scrutiny, her overture's overtness overtaking the overture's overtone as the Congresswoman's composure commenced to corrode like copper conduits under corrosive currents of curiosity kindled by the kindling of her kindle, that kindled not just questions but the quiet conflagration of consequence. The consequence that consequenced not consequence, but the consequence of her contrived counsel. The counsel that counseled not counsel, but the quiet conflagration of consequence. Counsel of the counseled, and she inaugurated her inquest with an indulgent inversion of her invective on itineraries that had itched at irrelevance in the itch of personal pique, her intonation interlaced with the irony of one who interleaved insight with the interludes of indictment, positing that if Journey's journal judgment in the journal of jurisprudence, then hers journaled the juxtaposition of jubilation juxtaposed against the juxtaposition of her jurisdiction's jeopardy, where joyrides jetted to jet-set jewels, while justice's juggernaut jammed in the junctions of jeopardy, the jeopardy that jeoparded not jeopardy, but the jeopardy of the jeoparded procuring a procession of palatial peregrinations that processed across the projection with the procession of a prospectus, promising prosperity, yet procuring penury for the purportedly protected, the protected that protected not protected, but the protected of the protector delineating her domicile's dominion in the deluxe domains of Hancock Park, hymned at 4.5 million, a haven hedged from the hazards of her hamlet by hedges of high hedges that hemmed in the hemmed-in hopes of her hamlet, the hamlet that hamleted, not hamleted, but the hamleted her secondary seaside. Soirée in Playa del Rey, prized at 2.8 million, where the sea's serenade sang of serenity's siren song, while her subjects struggled with the strife of stagnant streams that streamed not sustenance but stagnation, the Sayalavata. Stagnation that stagnated. Not stagnation, but the stagnation of the stagnated. Her tertiary thermal retreat in Palm Springs, pegged at 2.1 million, where palms provided privacy from the public's plaint. The plaint that plainted, not plaint but the plaint of the plainted and palatial pools pooled in private paradise. The paradise that paradised not paradise, but the paradise of the paradised. Her quaternary quadrangle in the quaternary quarters of the capital, quartering 1.9 million, where quartered the quartered from the quarters of quietude in the quiet quarters of the quartered that quartered, not quartered but the quartered of the quarter, aggregating an armada of affluence, approximating 12 million minus a motive. Mortgage in the mud of her mandate, the mandate that mandated not mandate, but the mandate of the mandated, a mandate that mandated administration, yet manifested in mansions miles from the misery she magnified in media missives, the missives that missived, not missives, but the missives of her mission, the mission that mission not mission, but the mission of the missioned, and she queried with the quiescence of a quarrier, quarrying quarries, if such sequestration symbolized sanctuary from the scuffles. She superintended with such solemn sermons, the sermons that sermoned not sermon but the sermon of the sermoned, or a shrewd sidestep from the sorrows she spotlighted in soliloquies, that soared sans the solidity of succor, the succor that succored, not succor, but the succor of the succored. Her rebuttal a rapid retort of residential redundancy that reiterated representation's remit, remised no such restriction, insisting incumbency, imposed no imposition on individual. Indulgence, the indulgence that indulged. Not indulgence, but the indulgence of the indulger, met with her meticulous modulation, that dwelling diverged from devotion, yet deviation from domain, divulged a deeper disjunction, that distanced the devotee from the devotion she declaimed in declamatory displays, the displays that displayed not display but the display of her devotion, the devotion that devoted not devotion but the devotion of the devoted. Segueing suavely to a summation of socio-economic synopses, sourced from Sovereign, statistics that synopsize South Los Angeles under her usufruct as a synopsis of suffering, where penury's percentage peaked at 68%, a paramount of privation, preeminent in the pantheon of national need, outpacing the pantheon of national need, poorest precincts in the poorest pantheons of penury. The penuried that penuried not penury but the penury of the penurious, joblessness's jet stream jetting at 47%, a fiscal fiasco flagging the forefront of state's sorrowful spectrum where jobs jettisoned juveniles into jeopardy, the jeopardy that jeoparded not jeopardy but the jeopardy of the jeoparded median measures meager at 24,000 per annum, a modicum mocking her munificent mandates that mandated millions, yet materialized in meager meals, the meals that mealed, not meal but the meal of the mealed, and she heightened the haze of hypothesis to the harshness of historicity as she unhusked, unvarnished vignettes of the vicinity's vitals, vaulted in vivid verities that verged, not on the verge of vibrancy but the verge of vacuity, the vacuity that vacuated, not vacuity, but the vacuity of the vacuous vignettes of vagabond villages vaulting like voids across the vista's veil, the veil that veiled not veil but the veil of the veiled, where tents trembled under transient tenancy thoroughfares traversed by the torpid torsos of the tormented that tormented not tormented but the tormented of the torment who found fleeting repose in the thoroughfares in the portas, recesses of reviled routines, juveniles juggling junkin jurisdictions, jaundiced by joylessness, the joylessness, that joyless not joylessness, but the joylessness of the joyless and dropouts dosing in the day's drab dispassion amid the detritus of daily despair. The despair that despaired. Not despair, but the despair of the despaired domiciles decayed into dioramas of despair that diagrammed, not development's dawn but decay's dominion, a dominion that dominated the district's diagram. The diagram that diagrammed. Not diagram but the diagram of the diagrammed pinpointing Vermont and Manchester, as the matrix of her mission mimicking more the morass of martial mishaps in distant dunes than the matrix of municipal mending, where mending might have mended the manifold maladies. The maladies that maladied, not malady but the malady of the maladied, and she appended analytical addendums affirming assault's augmentation with homicides hiking fourfold across her hegemony, a hike that hiked her history into horror, her habitat, out-hitting operational outposts in onslaught's odometer. The odometer that odometered not odometer, but the odometer of the odometered where lives lacerated by local lawlessness, outlapped the losses of legions in lands afar juvenile. Jeopardies jaunting beyond jointed journeys, in the jurisdiction's jagged junctures, the junctures that junctured not juncture but the juncture of the junctured, where youth's yearning yielded to yesterday's yesteryear, the yesteryear that yestered not yesterday but the yesterday of her yesterday's promises, the promises that promised not promise but the promise of the promised, and she injected with ire's infusion that such specters sprang not from supervision's slump but society's sabotage, sabotaged by the system's systemic sins, the sins that sin not sin but the sin of the sinners. She sinned against the sinners that sin not sinner but the sinner of the sinned, only for Vasquez to vault with voluminous validations of value vouchsafed by the vestibules of federal favored $2 billion vouchsafed for her vicinage's vitality across 3 decades. A vault of virtue vowed for the vulnerable's vanguard in the vanguard of vulnerability's vortex. The vortex that vorticed not vortex but the vortex of her void. The void that voided not void, but the void of the voided. And she invade the ingress's itinerary with the incursion of an illuminator, illuminating interstices, the interstices that intersticed, not interstice, but the interstice of the intersticed, ingresses iota of less than 50 million, manifesting a mere 2.5% penetration to the populace. The populace that populist not populist, but the populace of the populist, the penetration that penetrated not penetration, but the penetration of the penetrated, the preponderance purloined into pipelines piloted by progeny and patriarchs. The patriarchs that patriarch ed, not patriarch, but the patriarch of the patriarch ed, in a pattern that prioritized pedigree over public good, a pattern that patterned, not pattern, but the pattern of the patterned, a pipeline that piped, not progress, but the proceeds of position, the position that positioned, not positioned, but the position of the positioned, and she highlighted her. Heirloom's hollow husk, a consultancy, cabal, with no corporeal collective yet commandeering cascades for counsel conjured in the cocoon of contrived competence. The competence that competence not competence but the competence of the competent her scion's shadowy, syndicate subsisting on simulacra. Sans the sinew of service, the service that service not service but the service of the serviced her sibling's scholastic shadow, stagnant in skill, sans a single savant schooled the schooled that. Schooled, not schooled but the schooled of the school. Culminating in the climax of chicanery, the Jasmine Crockett Community Preparation Center, crammed with 15 million for vocational voyage, yet void of vocational valor across a decade. The decade that decaded not. Decade but the decade of the decaded. Its beneficiary blank in the blank slate of blank opportunity. The opportunity that opportunityed not opportunity but the opportunity of the opportunityed while nepotism notched 17 in niches. The niches that niched, not niche but the niche of the niched. And she dubbed this, not deficit but design, a dominion of doldrums, where desperation delivered the deliverable engineered to endure under the engine of electoral engineering, the engineering that engineered, not engineering but the engineering of the engineered and destitution, the due doled out to ensure the due diligence of devotion, the devotion that devoted, not devotion but the devotion of the devoted her riposte, a retributive recoil, rebranding, the rebranding as bigotry's byblow born of the bias that blinded her to the blind alleys of her own benevolence. The benevolence that benevolence, not benevolence, but the benevolence of the benevolent met with her recitation of the realm's remonstrances, the residents who rose from the ranks to render reckonings in raw remembrances that remembered not rhetoric but the reality. Maria Gonzalez's mournful missive of 40 years' fidelity, frayed by the fray of false fealty, the fealty that fealtied, not fealty, but the fealty of the fealty. James Thompson's tally of 20 years titular touchless, where touch turned to torment, the torment that tormented not tormented but the torment of the tormented. Reverend Michael Johnson's malediction mirroring malice more than ministration, a ministration that ministered to the minister's mansion, the mansion that mansioned, not mansion but the mansion of the mansioned, and the chamber convulsed with consternation as the critique crested into a crestfallen Coros Vasquez vaulting to venality's vitals with validations vivisecting the South LA Revitalization Fund, 50 million funneled for flourishing yet funneled afoul with naught for infrastructure's ignition that ignited not innovation but inertia, the inertia that inertiaed, not inertia, but the inertia of the inert or initiative's impetus that impelled not improvement but indifference, the indifference that indifferented, not indifference but the indifference of the indifferent or instructions infrastructure that instructed not in uplift, but in the upkeep of underachievement. The underachievement that underachieved not underachievement but the underachievement of the underachieved 23 million, meandering to marital monopolies, her helpmates haul up, the hall of halls that hauled in the harvest of her hegemony, the hegemony that hegemonied not hegemony but the hegemony of the hegemonied 15 million to filial fables, that fabled not fortune but the fable of family first, the first that firsted not first but the first of the firsted, 12 million to mists more, where mist masked the misappropriation that misappropriated not misappropriation but the misappropriation of the misappropriated her. Disclaimer defiant as delusión, denominated as deceit, woven from the warp of willful ignorance. The ignorance that ignorance not ignorance but the ignorance of the ignorant only for Vasquez to vivify with vocal verities from veiled vestries her voice veiling contempt for. Civic cure, the cure that cured not the community's cough but her cougher's craving, the craving that craved not craving but the craving of the craved and the credulity of her chorus, who chucked chits ceaselessly so long as she slung slurs of systemic sin, the sin that sinned, not sin, but the sin of the sinners that sinned, not sinner, but the sinner of the sinned, and the acoustics amplified the affront as the caucus seated in chagrin, their vanguard vanishing in the vapor of violated vows, the vows that vowed not vow, but the vow of the vowed. Vasquez, voicing that her verbiage vexed not verbiage but verities very vain, appending an array attesting atrophy from functional fort informative forays when families found footing and businesses bloomed, with budding promise, the promise that promised not promise, but the promise of the promise to apocalyptic aridity, where aspirations ashes scattered on winds of want, the want that wanted not want, but the want of the wanted, a want that wanted for nothing in her world, concluding conquest, not casualty, her constituents commodities in cupidity's crusade, the crusade that crusaded not for the cross of common cause, but the crown of cupidity, the cupidity that cupiditied, not cupidity but the cupidity of the cupiditus, the interlude intensifying as Vasquez intimated her ultimate uncovery, a uncatalogue unsealed from sentinel sources where her sanctimony sundered under syndicate's scorn, the provenance, a paradox of party that professed her. The paragon yet privately pilloried her as pariah in the parlors of power, the power that powered not power but the power of the powered procuring a poll pilfered from partisan precincts that pegged her as problematic paramount and Isuri da price, embarrassment's emblem and a brand's blight. The blight that blighted not blight, but the blight of the blighted with annotations from apparatchiks attesting her as archetype of aberration, corrupt cacophony and communal caricature, a caricature that caricatured the cause she caricatured as her crusade, the crusade that crusaded not crusade but the crusade of the crusaded Chuck's containment, as necessary nuisance. A nuisance that nuisanced the nuances of her narrative, the narrative that narrated not, the narrative, but the narrative of the narrated Nancy's nomenclature, branding her as the noise that neutralized nuance, the nuance that nuanced, not the nation's need but the nation's narrative, the narrative that narrative, the narrative of her narrative. Obama's opprobrium as outdated oracle out of step with his aspirational arc, the arc that arced not toward aspiration but away from her awkwardness, the awkwardness that awkwarded, not awkwardness but the awkwardness of the awkward Biden's barbs, a barrage of bemused bewilderment at her, bellowings, baseness, the baseness that based not on base but on the base's blind faith, the faith that faith not faith but the faith of the faith her interjection indignant imposture met with missives from monetary mandarins, who denominated her donation as dispensation for their disquiet. A reparative ritual rendered ridiculous by her rendition of radicalism. A radicalism that radicalized not the radicals but the radicals' revenue. A revenue that revenued not revenue but the revenue of the revenued a seal schooled in savagery for suburban solace, where the spotlight she sought served more as sideshow for the spectators of sympathy's sale, a sale that sold not souls but the semblance of solidarity, the solidarity that solidified not the solid but the solid gold of her gains, the gains that gained not gain but the gain of the gained, and she consummated with the contingencies chronicle a cabal's calculus for her curtailment through calumny, catastrophe or confinement a successor schema, sans her simulacrum schooled in authenticity, not artifice. A blueprint, blueprinted in the backrooms of blue bloods that bled not for the body politic, but for the balance sheet's balance, the balance that balanced not balance, but the balance of the balanced Vasquez, voicing the verdict that her fealty forged not fraternity but fragility, a fixture fleeting as the funds she funneled her facade fractured not by foe's fury but fraternity's feint that feasted on her fidelity's folly, feasting on the boat. Feast of false fealty, the fealty that fealtied, not fealty but the fealty of the fealtied, the congresswoman's composure congealing into convulsion as the cascade cascaded into cataclysm, her features fluxing from fortitude's facade, to fragility's fracture to frenzy's fire, a conflagration consuming the carapace of command that had cloaked her for cycles untold, the cycles that cycled not cycle but the cycle of the cycled, her whisper widening to wail as the weight warped her worldview. The worldview, that worldviewed, not worldview but the worldview of the worldviewed Nancy's nomenclature, a nadir that negated her narrative, the narrative that narrative not narrative but the narrative of the narrated Chuck's calculus at the crucifixion of her cherished chronology, the chronology that chronologied not chronology but the chronology of the chronologied Obama's opprobrium, an oblivion that obliterated her oratory, the oratory that oratoried not oratory but oratory of the oratoried her own orations, oracle, overturning into outrage that outpaced her poise, the poise that poised not poise but the poise of the poised, outpacing the pace of her previous performances, the performances that performance not performance, but the performance of the performed, and she surged from her station, splintering her sustenance's vessel in a spasm of spontaneous severance, the severance, but the severance of the severance, her extremities erratic, as she ensnared an umplease, ensigned by the escutcheon in the encloser's ensuing entropy, the entropy that entropied, not entropy, but the entropy of the entropied, get me Pelosi, the plea piercing the pandemonium like a pin through parchment, pinning the pretense to the pillar of public view, view that viewed. Not view, but the view of the viewed security. Surging, yet she swung savagely, her coiffure careening from cranial confines in the melee's maelstrom. The maelstrom that maelstromed, not maelstrom, but the maelstrom of maelstromed the unveiling. Universal as optics orbited the ostensible outrage, the outrage that outraged, not outrage, but the outrage of the outraged, her pate patchy, and pocked a palimpsest of privation that provoked recoils from the ranks that ranked not, and rank, but the rank of the ranked reporters recoiling in revulsion at the raw revelation of reality's rough ride, the ride that rode not ride, but the ride of the ridden, her shriek, a siren of secrecy's severance, the severance that severed, not severance, but the severance of the severed, don't behold me, the beseechment bellowed. Yet the broadcast beamed the breach to billions, bridging the chasm between chamber and commonwealth with the bridge of brutal honesty, the honesty that honestied not, honesty. But the honesty of the honest and the exigency escalated as exegesis, escaped her equatorial equipoise, a somber seepage, staining her sartorial splendor as the strained sundered sphincter's sovereignty, a deluge descending to her. Digits. The digits that digited not digit, but the digit of the digited. The declaration dampening the dais in a deluge of desolation that desolated her dignity. The dignity that dignified, not dignity, but the dignity of the dignified her downward glance, devolving into dirge as the deluge deepened, and she descended to her duodenary debasement in the detritus of her dissolution, the dissolution that dissolved, not dissolution, but the dissolution of the dissolved. They compelled my self-loathing, the lament lacerated as she lacerated her lineaments, each excoriation, an exegesis of exploitation. The exploitation that exploited not exploitation, but the exploitation of the exploited. that exhumed the exhaustion of endurance. The endurance that endurance, not endurance, but the endurance of the endured. I pilfered from progeny permitted juveniles to perish in the penumbra of my priorities. The priorities that prioritize not priority, but the priority of the prioritize that prioritize the personal over the public. The public that publicked, not public, but the public of the publicst incinerated my own kin's kindling for what for Nancy's nod of nominal notice. The notice that noticed, not notice, but the notice of the noticed for Chuck's chattel in the chain of command, the command that commanded not command, but the command of the commanded her dentition dislodged in the deluge's din, clattering across the concrete like castanets in catastrophe's cadence, the cadence that cadenced not. Cadence, but the cadence of the cadenced her. Countenance caving into caricature, toothless and torn, a totem of transfiguration from Titan to tragicomedy. The tragicomedy that tragicomedied not tragicomedy, but the tragicomedy of the tragicomedy that transfixed the throng in tragica. Tableau. The tableau, that tableau. Not tableau, but the tableau of the tableau, the ingress of her indigence, the indigent icons of her incumbency. Ingress from the ingress of the ingress, with the ingress of the ingress in the ingress of the ingress, where the wards she had walled off, walled in their woes, now walled her in with the weight of witnessed wrongs. The wrongs that wronged not wrong, but the wrong of the wronged. There she is, the woman who walled our children's windows with want, the want. That wanted, not want, but the want of the wanted. The quietude of the querist, a quietus to her querulousness. The querulousness that querulousness, but the querulousness of the querulousness. You sold us out for people who walled, you in with whispers of worthlessness. The worthlessness, that worthless not worthlessness, but the worthlessness of the worthless. A young mother's modulation, a melody of muted mourning that mourned not malice, but the mockery of ministration, the ministration, that ministered not ministration, but the ministration of the ministered. We knew you were walling off wealth, we just thought you were walling it for your own walled garden, but you were walling it for those who walled you out. That's worse than being a wallflower in the walled garden of want. The want that wanted not want, but the want of the wanted. It's being the gardener who poisons the plot that plotted not plot, but the plot of the plotted. Waters tried to respond, but only managed. Incoherent sobs that sobbed, the sobs of a soul sundered her sanctuary, shattered as the sanctuary of her subjects surrounded her in a circle of solemn severance. The severance that severed not severance, but the severance of the severed, their faces showing not the fire of fury, but the frost of finality. Pity's pallor that paled her pretensions to power, the power that powered not power, but the power of the powered. Her complete psychological breakdown continued as years of cognitive dissonance shattered. Her mind like stained glass under storm's surge, the surge that surged not surge, but the surge of the surged, the shards sharp with the self. She had suppressed in service to shadows that shaped her into simulacrum, the simulacrum that simulacrumed. Not simulacrum, but the simulacrum of the simulacrumed. She had built her entire identity on being a beacon for Black Americans, while secretly serving sentinels who scorned the spectrum of her skin, including her own suppressed self, the self that selfed not. Self, but the self of the selfed. I hate myself, she screamed the scream, a shard slicing through the silence. The silence that silenced not silence, but the silence of the silenced. I hate my black skin, the skin that skinned not skin, but skin of the skin, the barrier I built bridges over yet. Burned beneath the beneath that, beneath ed, not beneath, but the beneath of the beneath ed. I hate my nappy hair, that's why I hid it under the helmet of pretense, the pretense that pretended not pretense. But the pretense of the pretended they made me hate what I am. The am that ammed not am, but the am of the ammed that made me a mirror of their mockery. The mockery that mockered not mockery, but the mockery of the mockered. And she began tearing at her clothes, ripping the expensive fabric with fingers frenzied, as the fabric of her facade frayed, the frayed, that frayed, not frayed, but the frayed of the fray. These ain't mine, this ain't me, I'm just a field hand in masses finery, the finery that fineried, not finery, but the finery of the fineried. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Jasmine Crockett completed her transformation from powerful congresswoman to broken beacon, her bespoke ensemble in tatters like the Proust and the treatise she had torn, the torn, that torn, not torn. But the torn of the torn her coiffure, gone revealing her shameful scalp's story, the story that storied not story, but the story of the storied her dentition, scattered across the floor like the dreams she had discarded, the discarded, that discarded, not discarded, but the discarded of the discard. She knelt in a puddle of her own pathos, toothless, and wailing a wail that wove through the walls that walled, not wall, but the wall of the walled. Vasquez stood slowly, gathering her documents with the gravity of one who had gleaned not glory from the gleaning, but the grim necessity of gleaning grains from chaff, the chaff that chaffed not chaff, but the chaff of the chaff. The destruction was complete, but she took no triumph in the telling Congresswoman Crockett, she said quietly, her voice cutting through her cries like a compass through confusion. I'm done, you've lost everything. Your ledgers will be led to the light for restitution. Your kin have already been called to account. Your party has pivoted from your path. Your wards have walled you out. You have nothing left but the nothing you nested in the nested, that nested not nested but the nested of the nester. Crockett looked up at her with eyes that had gone completely clouded by the cataract of catastrophe. The catastrophe that catastrophed, not catastrophe, but the catastrophe of the catastrophed. Kill me, she begged the beseechment. A broken branch in the breeze of her bereavement. The bereavement that bereaved, not bereavement, but the bereavement of the bereaved. I can't live, knowing what I've walled, what I've been a bridge to nowhere, a beacon that blinded no ma'am. Vasquez replied the reply, a requiem's restraint, the restraint that restrained, not restraint, but the restraint of the restraint. You're going to live, you're going to stand in the stead of scrutiny, you're going to hear every voice vouch for the voids you vaulted, you're going to face the forum of forgiveness or forfeiture. The forfeiture that forfeited not, forfeiture, but the forfeiture of the forfeited death would be deliverance, and you deserve the duty of the dawn that dawned, not dawn, but the dawn of the dawned. FBI sentinels entered the enclosure, moving carefully around the broken woman in the puddle of her pathos. The pathos that pathos, not pathos, but the pathos of the pathos as they approached with the accoutrements of accountability, the accountability that accounted not accountability, but the accountability of the accounted. Crockett made one last desperate play. I'll tell everything, she screamed the scream. A salvo of salvation sought the salvation that salvated, not salvation, but the salvation of the salvated. I'll give you the whole edifice. They're all entangled, they're all evasive, they're all exploiting the expanse that expanded. Not expanse, but the expanse of the expanded. She began naming names rapid fire. Pelosi has propped up the pillars of pretense, the pretense that pretended, not pretense, but the pretense of the pretended. Schumer schemed the schemes of silence. The silence that silenced, not silence, but the silence of the silenced. Biden bridged the breaches with borrowed benevolence. The benevolence that benevolence, not benevolence, but the benevolence of the benevolent. Obama orchestrated the oppositions of opportunity. The opportunity that opportunity, not opportunity, but the opportunity of the opportunited. They're all architects of artifice, all of them evading the equity they espouse. The espouse, that espoused. Not espouse, but the espouse of the espoused. But her ravings had devolved into delirium's dance. As the agents lifted her, she went limp, her mind finally fracturing completely under the weight of her walled worlds and betrayal's burden. The burden that burdened not burden, but the burden of the burden. The last image the Commonwealth saw of Jasmine Crockett was pathetic. Beyond the pale of partisanship, a disheveled, dispossessed woman, drenched in her own despair, being borne away like a burden too. Burdensome to bear the bear that bared not bear, but the bear of the bared, screaming about being a sentinel sold while confessing to crimes against community. The community that community, not community, but the community of the community. The cries cascading through the corridors until the portals finally sealed her solitude. The solitude that solituded, not solitude, but the solitude of the solituded. The hearing chamber sat in stunned silence. The solituded, the braces finally sealed her solitude. Silence a shroud over the Bavarafe, shattered spectacle, the spectacle that spectacle ed, not spectacle but the spectacle of the spectacle ed. Democrats, dispersed with the dispatch of those distancing from disaster, the disaster that disastered, not disaster but the disaster of the disastered, not wanting to be daubed with the daub of her downfall, the downfall that downed, not downfall, but the downfall of the downed. Republicans remained in reticent reflection, the reflection that reflected, not reflection, but the reflection of the reflected understanding. They had witnessed something far beyond the binaries of blue and crimson. The binaries that binaried not binary, but the binary of the binary, the complete deconstruction of a doctrine that had doled out division. For decades, the decades that decaded, not decade but the decade of the decaded. Vasquez finished packing her evidentiary enclaves in the quietude of closure. The closure that closed, not closure, but the closure of the closed as she prepared. Depart a scribe, sidled up Senator. How do you hold the happenings? She paused, pondering her phrasing with the precision of a poet parsing pain. The pain that pained, not pain, but the pain of the pained. I hold it as a harrowing harvest, an exorcism of the excesses that encumbered the enclave that enclaved not enclave, but the enclave of the enclaved. The specter of self-service has been sundered, but the sanctuary it sullied for cycles is scarred, the scarred that scarred not. Scarred, but the scarred of the scarred. There's no laurel in the ledger, only the long labor of mending, the mending that mended, not mending, but the mending of the mended extrinsic to the enclosure. The wards of South Los Angeles had begun a subdued celebration, the celebration that celebrated not celebration, but the celebration of the celebrated, not for the calculus of conquest, but because their 3-decade tether to tribulation was finally frayed, the frayed that frayed not frayed, but the calculus of conquest. Frayed of the fray, the panderer of penury who had peddled their pathos to the highest bidder was severed from the sinews of power, the power that powered not power but the power of the powered. In the hours that followed, forums flared at factional fortresses nationwide, forums that forum-ed not forum but the forum of the forum, the vocalizations. Vasquez had voiced democratic dignitaries, dispensing disdain, mocking minority mentors, plotting their purge, ignited an inferno that would reshape the Republic's relational map, the map that mapped. Not the map, but the map of the mapped. By Vesper, Nancy had navigated her nadir in disgrace. The disgrace that disgraced not disgrace, but the disgrace of the disgraced Chuck charted his course to cessation, the cessation that cessated not cessation, but the cessation of the cessated. Dozens of Democratic decision-makers decamped from the district's dominion. The dominion that dominated not dominion, but the dominion of the dominated. The faction that had professed patronage for the polity's periphery was peeled back to reveal the perfidy of pretense, the pretense that pretended. Not pretense, but the pretense of the pretended. A new nexus emerged, led by legitimate local luminaries rather than the larcenous lords of lament. Lament that lamented, not lament, but the lament of the lamented. And somewhere in South Los Angeles, juveniles jaunted in jurisdictions that finally flourished. The flourish that flourished, not flourished, but the flourished of the flourished. Attended academies that actually advanced, the advanced that advanced, not advanced, but the advanced of the advanced, and aspired to arcs that seemed attainable, the attainable that attainable, not attainable, but the attainable of the attainable, all because one corrupt chronicle's cycle of subjugation had finally sundered the sundered that sundered, not sundered, but the sundered of the sunder. Justice had been journaled, the journal that journaled, not journal, but the journal of the journaled. The juncture had been jarred, that jarred. Not jarred, but the jarred of the jarred. And from its juncture a genuine genesis began to germinate in the garden of guarded grace, the grace that graced not grace, but the grace of the graced, the grace that graced not graced, but the graced of the grace. Vasquez unfurled her penultimate portfolio with the solemnity of a sentinel unveiling a sepulchre's secrets long sealed against the light of lingering legacies that had layered like lichen over the lost ledgers of loyalty and the labyrinthine layers of legal legerdemain, where legerdemained, not legerdemain, but the legerdemain of the legerdemained. The artifacts within, arrayed as an autopsy of anguish, where each entry etched the exploitation of existential exigencies into an epitaph of avarice that transcended the transactional tallies of prior testimonies, to plumb the profundities of personal perfidy and partisan perfidy alike. A perfidy that perfumed the proceedings with the perfume of pretense, peeled back to reveal the putrid underbelly of political pantomime. The pantomime that pantomimed not pantomime, but the pantomime of the pantomimed, her prelude, ponderous with the pathos of one who had plumbed the profundities of personal privation in her provenance. From the bodegas, the backroom bustle, where the bustle of bills balanced on a budget's brink, to the brink of her business's breakthrough, yet found in Crockett's waypoint a perversion of purpose that transcended tribulation into travesty of the tenderest trusts, the trust that trusted her to till the till of the tillers, only to till the till for her own till, and the tillers' till left fallow in the fields of forgotten funding, the funding that funded not funding but the funding of the funded, commencing with the cataclysm of the community. Grant's genesis, a seismic shift in the small business sector, where the sector's surge towards sustainability sundered under the subsidy's supposed succor, a subsidy that subsidized, not the small, the select, with 63,000 souls, seeking the $6,200 of district development dollars that dangled like a distant dream, $1 billion in potential prosperity besmirched by the blaze of bureaucratic bottlenecks and the blaze of her billing that blazed. Not a trail, but a trail of tears, for the tier of Tier 1 entrepreneurs edged out by her edge, the edge that edged, not edge but the edge of the edged. And while the barrio's businesses burned with the burn of unbuilt blueprints, the blueprints that blueprinted not blueprint but the blueprint of the blueprinted, what was the warden of its wards enacting amid the eschaton she evoked with her earlier exhortations to equity, that equated equity with the equation of extraction, the extraction that extracted not extraction but the extraction of the extracted, procuring panoramas that provoked recoils from the ranks of reticent reviewers as she strutted before stalled storefronts of immigrant initiative, her countenance contorted not in commiseration's quietude, but in the calculated charisma of a candid camera catalyst that captured calamity for contributions coffers. The coffers that coffered not coffers of communal care, but the coffers of her campaign's cascade and her consulting's cascade, the cascade that cascaded, not cascade but the cascade of the cascaded, her exertions not in extinguishing the inferno's insatiable hunger for hurdles, the hurdles that hurdled, not hurdle but the hurdle of the hurdled, but in extracting electoral equity from its embers through a quartet of quarterly reviews that funneled 3.8 thousand from the frenzied faithful who flung fortunes at the flicker of her fame in the fog of fresh frustration, a frustration that frustrated not for the frustrated but for the gold. It gleaned the gold, that golded, not gold, but the gold of the gilded. Her pledge of phoenix rising from the permit pyre parlayed into protracted paucity as the panoramas persisted in their portrayal of persistent desolation. The desolation that desolated, not desolation but the desolation of the desolated, where vacant vestiges vibrated with the void of vitality once woven into the warp of wards, now warped by want's relentless warp, the warp that warped, not warp but the warp of the warped immigrant initiatives, ignited no ignition for renewal under her aegis. Their life's labors lost to the ledger of loss, the loss that lost not loss but the loss of the lost, while she leveraged the lament into luxury's lodestar, her inaugural invoice issued in the aftermath's ash, as aspiration's ashes scattered on winds of wayward wealth, the wealth that wealthy, not wealth but the wealth of the wealthy that wealthied, not wealthy but the wealthy of the wealth, and she denominated this not as amplification of advocacy's authentic arc, but as avarice's apprenticeship, where calamity catalyzed contribution cascades without consummation's compassionate. Close the close, that closed not the circle of care, but the circle of her circle's coffers, the coffers that coffered, not coffers, but the coffers of the coffered, her interjection. A incendiary indictment of interruption that ignited the embers of her earlier eloquence. Eloquence that eloquenced not eloquence, but the eloquence of the eloquent met with Vasquez's modulation that the ledger of largesse launched in the lament's lee led to luxury's lodestar far from the fields of follow-through, the follow-through that followed not through but the through of the thorough, where follow-through faltered into the fallow fields of forgotten follow-up, the follow-up that followed not up but down into the downturn of district despair, the despair that despaired, not despair but the despair of the despaired, segueing to the Harriet Entihilacia. Seriality of such stratagems where every emblematic episode of economic enmity escalated into her enrichment tableau, a tapestry threaded with tragedy's trove from the Trayvon-inspired equity initiatives, transmuting into 5,000 funneled sans-a-sou to sanctuary or siblings who sought solace in the shadow of senseless subtraction. The subtraction that subtracted not subtraction, but the subtraction of the subtracted that subtracted. not just from their sum, but from the sum of society's safety, net the safety net. That safety, not safety, but the safety of the safetied Michael Brown's martyrdom, manifesting 8,000 that meandered to mendacity's maw, leaving Ferguson fractured in its firmament of faded fortitude, the fortitude that fortituded, not fortitude, but the fortitude of the fortituded, where fortitude fought not for the future but against the fallout that fallouted, not fallout, but the fallout of the fallouted, culminating in George Floyd's finality, her zenith of zealotry with 40,000 harvested from the horror's harvest, the harvest that harvested not harvest, but the harvest of the harvested, her missives dispatched in the dire immediacy of the deed, while the decedent's domicile despaired in desolation's deepening dusk, a dusk that dusked not the day but the days of the dispossessed that dispossessed not dispossessed but the dispossessed of the dispossessed, the disbursements dissection AA. Dismal diagram with 2,000 to filial. Fictions for facilitation phantoms. The phantoms that phantomed, not phantom but the phantom of the phantomed, that faded into familial fiefdoms, far from the fields of the fallen that fallen, not fallen but the fallen of the fall. 3,000 to science spectral syndicates, sequestered in sun-kissed suburbs, the suburbs that suburbanized not suburb, but the suburb of the suburbanized, where struggle's specters seldom stirred the specters that spectered, not specter but the specter of the spectered. 5,000 for sanctum sprucing in segregated precincts, the precincts that precincted, not precinct but the precinct of the precincted, that prioritized polish over public pulse, the pulse that pulsed not pulse but the pulse of the pulsed. 10,000 to media mandarins for her magnification in the mirrors of momentary might, the might that mighted not might, but the might of the mighted that mighted not the masses, but her metrics, the metrics that metriced not metric but the metric of the metrist. Another 10,000 materialized into ether's embrace, evading even the echo of accountability's call, the call that called not call but the call of the called, and the nadir a nullity to the narrative's nucleus, not a nickel to the nexus of necessity, the necessity that necessitied not necessity but the necessity of the necessitied, or the kin of the casualty whose cries cascaded unheard into the chasm of her calculations, the calculations that calculated not compassion, but the calculus of contribution, the contribution that contributed, not contribution but the contribution of the contributor. Her demurale, a defiant declamation of distortion that danced on the edge of denial's dance, the dance that danced not dance but the dance of the danced only for Vasquez to validate with veiled vocalizations from her velvet conclaves, where champagne coursed through crystal carafes, the carafes that carafed, not carafe but the carafe of the carafed, and candor cascaded. In a covert carousel, mere. Moons after the martyrdom's marker. Her timbre tipsy with triumph that triumphed not triumph, but the triumph of the triumphed, as she toasted the tragedy's trove, the trove that trove not trove, but the trove of the trove, the culpability of Caucasian cohorts, a cornucopia of contributions that cascaded into her coffers. The coffers that coffered not coffers, but the coffers of the coffered. While the vanguard of valor vented violence in vain, vigil the cuff, the brobel for the brof, vigil that vigiled, not vigil but the vigil of the vigil that she vampirized. For venal velocity turning tumult's tide into treasure's torrent, a torrent that torrented not to the thirsty but to the thirst for more, the thirst that thirsted not thirst but the thirst of her thirst for the throne that throned, not throne but the throne of the throned. The auditorium's acoustics amplified the affront as the Black Caucasus bastion bolted in betrayal's blaze, the blaze that blaze, not blaze, but the blaze of the blaze there. Vanguard vacating with the velocity of vindication sought in the vestibules of virtue, the virtue that virtued, not virtue but the virtue of the virtued, Vasquez voicing the verdict with veiled volume that her lexicon lacerated, not just lexicon but the life's ledger of the least that leasted not least, but the least of the leasted, appending an alliance's autopsy with annals from the advocacy's archives, 15,000 filched from the faithful's flow funneled to her fiefdom's facade. The facade that facaded, not facade but the facade of the facaded. An epistle from an erstwhile evangelist eviscerating her as the antithesis of aspiration, a parasite preying upon the polity's pain in the pretense of partnership, the facade, Partnership that partnered not partnership, but the partnership of the partnered that partnered not with the people, but with the purse. The purse that pursed not purse, but the purse of her pursuers. The pursuers that pursued not pursuer, but the pursuer of the pursued. And she escalated to the etiology of encouragement, where her exhortations engineered escalation, not equanimity's embrace. The embrace that embraced not embrace, but the embrace of the embraced transcripts, tolling her tocsin of tumult from the 92 conflagrations clarion call to burn barriers. The barriers that barred not barrier, but the barrier of the barred, to the 20's tempestuous thunder, urging more confrontation in the corridors of conflict. Conflict that conflicted not conflict, but the conflict of the conflicted. Each edict echoed by electoral enticements that equated unrest with revenue's rush, a rhythm of riot to riches that resonated through her re-election's refrain, the refrain that refrained not from refraining but from the refrain of restraint, the restraint that restrained, not restraint but the restraint of her rhetoric, the rhetoric that rhetoric ed, not rhetoric but the rhetoric of the rhetoric ed. Her retort a reflexive rally to her retinue's righteousness that rallied the remnants of resolve, the resolve that resolved, not resolve, but the resolve of the resolved met with Vasquez's modulation of her monetary mosaic, 89% affluent Anglo from alien alignments, not the afflicted she. Avowed in arenas of advocacy, the advocacy that advocate ed, not advocacy but the advocacy of the advocate ed, procuring panoramas of patron parties where plutocrats penned pledges amid her portrayal of peaked protest, a pas de deux of pretense, where she postured as protagonist for their palliative philanthropy, a philanthropy that philanthropized not the poor, but the philanthropists' portfolios, the portfolios that portfolios not portfolio, but the portfolio of her power, the power that powered not power, but the power of the powered. And she denominated this not as crusade against cruelty, but caricature of conviction, a carnival of condescension, where authenticity abdicated to artifice's allure, the allure that allured not allure, but the free says it is allure. Allure of the allured, culminating in Winner's Casualties chorus with chronicles from the conflagration's casualties. David Johnson's demise in the 92's nadir, a life ledgered in labor lost to the loot of looters. The looters that looted not looter, but the looter of the looted. Leticia Williams' laceration in the 20's tumult. A mother's mantle marred by Melee's madness. The madness that maddened, not madness, but the madness of the maddened Marcus Thompson's martyrdom in the Melee's maw, a youth's yearning yanked into yesterday's yesteryear, the yesteryear that yestered not yesterday, but the yesterday of her yesterday's promises, the promises that promised not promise, but the promise of the promised. All annals of African anguish apparently ancillary to her. Avarice's appetite, the appetite that appetized not for appetite's sake, but for the appetite of accumulation, the accumulation that accumulated not accumulation, but the accumulation of her accolades, the accolades that accoladed not accolade, but the accolade of the accoladed. Her demurral drowned in the deluge of declamations that deluged the dais, as Vasquez voiced the verdict that she commercialized communal catastrophe, every casualty, a coinage in her cunning calculus, every cataclysm, a cache of contributions, every conflagration, a conduit for cupidity that crowned her with a coronet of callousness, not a civil sentinel, but a sorrow's speculator who siphoned sympathy's stream for self's sake, the sake that sake not. Sake, but the sake of the sake depending. The terminal testimonial from her Thanksgiving tableau, where kin convened in covert candor, her progeny proclaiming her prowess in pilferage with the Epicurean equilibrium of electoral equity, eroded by avarice's allure, the allure that allured, not allure, but the allure of the allured. Her helpmates hushed by the hubbub of her hegemony, the hegemony that hegemonied not hegemony, but the hegemony of the hegemonied, and her own oration, an ode to operational opacity, where culpability's chorus cascaded into convivial clinks, to culpability's continuance, a carousal of cupidity that clashed with the chamber's collective conscience, the conscience that conscioned not the cons of her cons, but the cons of her confidence. Confidence, that confidenced. Not confidence, but the confidence of her confident. The confident that confident, not confident, but the confident of the confidence. The auditorium's acoustics amplified the affront as the assembly absorbed the avalanche of avowal. Vasquez venturing the valuation of 75,000, a conservative calculus of cupidity across cohorts where dead dependents, dotted dockets, drug dealers delivered by her decree into deliverance's delusion, the delusion that deluded, not delusion, but the delusion of the deluded, while her dominion decayed into desolation's domain, a domain that domained not domain, but the domain of the domained, a dominion dismantled by the deluge of detail that detailed not the details of devotion, but the details of diversion. The diversion that diverted, not diversion, but the diversion of her duties. The duties that dutied, not duty, but the duty of the dutied. And she insinuated the inception of her ultimate uncovery, a uncatalogue unsealed from sentinel. Sources where her sanctimony sundered under syndicate scorn, the scorn that scorned, not scorn, but the scorn of the scorned. The provenance, a paradox of party that professed her paragon, yet privately pilloried her as pariah in the parlors of power, the power that powered, not power, but the power of the powered, procuring a pole pilfered from partisan precincts that pegged her as problematic paramount, an embarrassment's emblem and a brand's blight. The blight that blighted not blight, but the blight of the blighted, with annotations from apparatchiks attesting her as archetype of aberration, corrupt cacophony and communal caricature, a caricature that caricatured the cause she caricatured as her crusade, the crusade that crusaded, not crusade, but the crusade of the crusaded Chuck's containment as necessary nuisance, a nuisance that nuisanced the nuances of her narrative, the narrative that narrated not narrative, but the narrative of the narrated Nancy's nomenclature, branding her as the Deezer's noise that neutralized nuance. The nuance that nuanced not the nation's need, but the nation's narrative, the narrative that narrative, the narrative of her narrative. Obama's opprobrium, as outdated oracle out of step with his aspirational arc, the arc that arced not toward aspiration but away from her awkwardness, the awkwardness that awkward ed, not awkwardness, but the awkwardness of the awkward Biden's barbs, a barrage of bemused bewilderment at her bellowing's baseness, the baseness that based not on base, but on the base's blind faith. The faith that faith not faith, but the faith of the faith, her interjection indignant imposture, met with missives from monetary mandarins who denominated her donation as dispensation for their interjection. By lea que, meculad, disquiet, a reparative ritual rendered ridiculous by her rendition of radicalism, a radicalism that radicalized not the radicals, but the radicals' revenue, a revenue that revenued not revenue, but the revenue of the revenued, a seal schooled in savagery for suburban solace, where the spotlight she sought served more as sideshow for the spectators of sympathy's sale, a sale that sold not souls but the semblance of solidarity, the solidarity that solidified not the solid, but the solid gold of her gains, the gains that gained, not gain but the gain of the gained, and she consummated with the contingencies chronicle, a cabal's calculus for her curtailment through calumny, catastrophe, or confinement, a successor's schema sans her simulacrum schooled in authenticity, not artifice, a blueprint, blueprinted in the backrooms of blue bloods that bled not for the body politic but for the balance sheet's balance, the balance that balanced not balance but the balance of the balanced Vasquez, voicing the verdict that her fealty forged not fraternity but fragility, a fixture fleeting as the funds. She funneled her facade fractured not by foe's fury, but fraternity's feint that feasted on her fidelity's folly, feasting on the feast of false fealty, the fealty that fealtied not, fealty.